hear your word and hear what you put on Nathan's heart and how you intended us to read your word. And I just ask that you will be with us during this time, and I ask that you will guide us into getting back into some kind of normality. In Jesus' name we pray.
Good evening, everybody. You'll turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 14. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 16. While you're turning there, or whatever it is you do, flip there, or click there, or scroll there, whatever. I was thinking about how a lot of the movies that I like, and maybe some of y'all identify with this too, they're war movies. I like war movies, and I'm not the only one because they keep making them. And I got to thinking, why is it that we like war movies? And on the one hand, I think there's a part of us that understands the condition of the world that we live in. And there's something about a war movie, especially when there's very clearly good guys and very clearly bad guys, and we want the good guys to win. There's something inside of us that longs for the injustice that we see in this world, the fact that this world is not the way it's supposed to be. We want it to be okay. We want the bad guys to be defeated in the end, and there's a part of us that is longing for that. And so there's a sense in which war movies actually sort of point us towards Christ, because we know from the scriptures that one day everything will be made right. And when we read Revelation, and we read some of the other parts of the Bible that talk about the end and that kind of thing, it is described in terms of war. And that's all well and good, and we're going to see a little bit of that in this passage, or maybe a lot of that in this passage, but really, war is a result of the fact that this is a fallen world that we live in. It's most of the time occurs because people are evil. And so what we're going to look at in this passage is a story about a war. It's really the first story of war that the Bible ever describes. And it's related to Abraham. And so we're going to see how that all fits together. And again, war being a symptom of the fact that we live in a broken world. And so through this passage, we're going to be reminded that even though we live in a broken world, God is still faithful. And so, again, if you join with me in Genesis 14, starting in verse 1. Now look, there's a bunch of place names and a bunch of people names from the ancient Near East that are going to be hard to say, hard to pronounce. I'm just going to go with them as best as I know how and pretend that I know what I'm talking about. And it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Told you those were interesting. All these came as allies to the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim and Ham, and the Emim and Shavah Kiriathaim, I can't even do that one, and the Horites and their Mount Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to in Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and conquered all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and they fell into them, but those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. Then a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So, kind of backtracking just a little bit, we've got this man Abram, who has settled his tent in the land of Canaan in the chapters before. His nephew Lot is in the Jordan Valley near the city of Sodom. This man Abram is where he is because God has promised Abram that he would be a blessing, that he would have descendants, and that he would have this land where he was. And so in this passage, as we talked about last week, Abram is in the land of Canaan. Lot has separated and gone into the Jordan Valley. And now the writer of Genesis is putting this whole, what has been a sort of an individual and a family story in the context of like international events. And so this is what some would call the War of the Four Kings. And this passage, like I said, really highlights the fallen state of the world. If we were to have started at the beginning of Genesis and read about the creation and the fall, and then things kind of go forward a little bit, and then we've got the story of Noah and the flood, there's sort of this renewal, but starting, very quickly after the flood story is over, the effects of the fall continue to spiral downwards. And we have the story of Noah and his drunkenness and all that goes along with that, and we have the Tower of Babel and all of those kind of things. And this is just one more thing, this war that's described that sort of highlights this idea that the world is really broken by sin. But what this passage also helps us to see is that God is still faithful, in this particular case to Abraham. And we see sort of some foreshadowing of God's plan to rescue us from sin and to restore creation back to the way it was intended. And so in these first 7 verses, goodness gracious, the place names and the people names are difficult. If you get lost in all of that, basically what's going on here is you've got 4 major kings that live like in present day Iraq, around the area of Babylon. And these guys are like powerful kings. And then in the Jordan River Valley, you've got these 5 like sort of minor kings. They're like just the king of a city. And for some time, these 5 minor kings had been paying tribute to the bigger kings over there in Babylon. But then they decide, we're not going to do that anymore. We're wealthy. We're not going to pay those other kings tribute anymore. And so war breaks out between these 2 groups, the group of the 4 major kings from Babylon and the 5 kings in the Jordan Valley. And like I said, this is the first time war has ever really been talked about in the Bible at all. And what ends up happening is these 4 powerful kings come in and absolutely wipe the floor up with these 5 minor kings. They come in and defeat them pretty soundly. In kind of sifting through all of the geography and the politics of all of this, really we can just recognize the fact that the world is broken. The war is just one of those things that exist because we live in a broken world. You've got this war being fought basically because one group of people wants to dominate somebody else, and then that group of people wanting to be rebellious against somebody who's in authority over them. And so domination of people over others, rebellion against authority, those are all consequences of living in a fallen world. And we have to remember that the brokenness we see in this world, whether it's war or just people being ugly to each other in general, is the result of sin. And it's not hard for us to recognize that although this story is happening thousands of years ago in the ancient Middle East, our world is still broken today. And that has not changed. Brokenness still exists. And really those tendencies that cause this war and really any other war to break out are really tendencies within ourselves. And unless we're a king or in charge of a country or something, we're not causing wars, but we cause conflict with each other by wanting to dominate other people and have our way or be bossy, as we might say. We have conflict because we want something that somebody else has. We rebel against those that are in authority over us. So all of those things are still present even in our lives because we are fallen sinners who are living in a broken world. And so as we look around at the world that we live in, we should again recognize the brokenness in ourselves and be saddened by that, but also as we look at the world around us, the brokenness that we see, as we have opportunity to address brokenness, we ought to, but we ought to also realize that there's not anything we can do to end that brokenness or fix that brokenness ourselves. That there's something bigger that we need to put our trust in than our own efforts to try to make the world a better place, so to speak. Although we should do what we can to try. As we look at verses, so again, verses 1 through 7, big idea there that the world is broken. We need to remember that. In verses 8 through 12, so after all of the geography is described, after the scene is set up, we have the actual fighting in verses 8 through 12. And like I said, the four kings from Babylon, defeat these five little kingdoms pretty easily. They're routed. It says that the army, the kings and the armies of the five kingdoms, they fled. Some of them, ran into the mountains to hide. Some of them get caught up in some tar pits. One commentator I read suggested that was probably suicidal. That they were fleeing these four kings and would rather die in these tar pits. Some versions may have the word bitumen. I had to look that up, what that was, but it's basically tar, asphalt, what we make roads of today. But it's an important resource back in those days as well for making things waterproof and whatnot. But anyways, so here's the deal. When we look at verses 8 through 12, you've got this big picture, geopolitical, nations against nations, but then it kind of comes down to, in verse 8 through 12, it gets kind of personal, like people are actually dying, like people are having to flee. And then we get real personal when we single out Lot, and Lot gets captured by these four kings and carried off into captivity, presumably towards Babylon, which sort of prefigures what will happen to Israel later on. But anyways, what we can learn from verses 8 through 12 is that while brokenness sort of is a big picture kind of thing is real and exists in our world, that brokenness is a personal thing too. Like real people in this story, like I said, get killed. Real people maybe commit suicide. Real people flee for their lives. Real people get captured. And so we know all too well that the global effects of sin affect us on a personal level. People really do suffer as individuals. People really do die as individuals. That's part of life in this broken world that we live in. And we need to recognize that that's the state that we find ourselves in apart from God. Like that's just where we are. We live in a world where people suffer and people die. We need to recognize that whatever worldly comforts we may have in this life, that those things are temporary. So we think back to the story that we read last week, where Lot picked the place where he picked because it looked good. It had the best land. It was in an area that was wealthy, and we don't really get we don't get every bit of his motives in picking the land that he did, but it appears that he picked this land because he thought it would make him safe. And we find that what the things that we think make us safe can be taken away from us like that. They're temporary. If this whole situation we find ourselves in right now has taught us anything, it might be that we can't count on any of that kind of stuff. And so Lot helps us to learn that lesson, that these things that we have in this world that we tend to put our faith and trust in are temporary. And we need to recognize that, like Lot, who, I imagine as he's being carried off, is wondering what in the world's going to happen to him. He's probably scared, and realizes that there's not really anything he could do about it. The same thing with us. There's not anything we can do to fix the situation that we live in, where we are captive to sin and we are subject to death. We're captives in need of being set free. And these first 2 points about the world being broken and that brokenness being personal, that's sort of the bad news of it. But in verses 13 through 16, the light breaks through, and there's good news. So what happens in verse 13, that there's an escapee. Somebody has escaped this whole battle and being captured by the 4 kings from Babylon, and he comes and runs to Abram. And we're told that Abram is still where he was, where we left him off in verse 18 of chapter 13 at the Oaks of Mamre, and that he has some neighbors that he's evidently become friendly with, and that he has over 318 it says, trained men born in his house. And so a couple things just on a practical level about Abram here. Abram evidently had gathered a lot of wealth and employees or whatever, like people that lived in his household and were his workers. And evidently he had trained them, presumably for battle. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing for us to keep in mind. We've been looking at the life of Abraham as being one of faith in God. And that's the main theme here. But there's a tension there of, yes, we trust God, but Abram was also smart with the things that God had given him. God had blessed him with all of these resources, and he used some of those resources, it appears, to kind of be able to defend himself if necessary, if something like an attack happened. So kind of an interesting thing there to consider of trusting in God, but being good stewards of what we have as well. And again, that there's this relationship it says he has with the Mamre, the Amorite, Eshcol, and the brother of Anar, who are allies with Abram. So Abram has made friends. So that there's something to be said for us of in living in this broken world that we live in, to make peace with people as best we can, and live peaceably with our neighbors. And then what we find is that Abram is told about Lot. Now this is Lot, who really sort of disrespected him in the last passage, and has kind of gone his own way. But what we find is that Abram still loved his nephew, and so he that's an example that we should follow too. That in this world we live in, where we have people we love that sometimes let us down, we should still continue to love them, because that's how God feels about us too. And we ought to be willing, as Abram is here, to be used by God to pursue those who have fallen away. And that's not really what this passage is about, but it's a reminder to us. And so Abram goes and takes his men, takes his allies that he's got, and they go chase after this retreating army that has been victorious up to this point, and they catch them. And it says in verse 15 that he divided his forces against them at night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and then began to chase them further north, if you're looking at all those geographic names there. So Abraham pursues the four kings, defeats them, and is able to rescue his nephew. Now, what's implied there is that his little army of 300 people, in defeating these four powerful kings from Babylon, had to have had some kind of supernatural help. There's no way Abram did all of this on his own, which sort of leads me to kind of a side note on apologetics. This is actually a passage that's, if you do any research on it, it's fairly criticized by skeptics as being not true. But the effort that the writer of Genesis, Moses, put into listing all these place names is pretty meticulous. But also that sort of the understated way in which this battle is described. Every myth I've ever heard, every lie I've ever heard is embellished. There's all kind of details. There's all kind of just, make this kind of a big deal. We don't get any of that. We just get, he defeated them. That's it. So to me, that helps, from an apologetics point of view, sort of give some credence to the story, some confirmation there that the word of God that we have is accurate. Those places really do exist, and this battle really did happen. Big picture in Abram's story. So remember, Abram has been promised that you're going to be a blessing to others. You're going to have land. You're going to have descendants who will number like the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky and all that kind of stuff. What we see in this passage, as far as God's faithfulness goes, is God beginning to keep that promise that Abram is a blessing to Lot in going after these four kings and rescuing him. And it's also a fulfillment of the part of the promise where God says, those who bless you will be blessed and those who curse you will be cursed. You have this group of kings essentially oppose Abram, and Abram is able to defeat them. So we have God keeping that promise. But what we really want to do when we look in these passages about Abram in Genesis is see how do they point us to the even bigger picture of what is God doing to bring about salvation for his people. And so this story helps us to look forward to Jesus, because we know that ultimately Jesus is going to be how those promises to Abram are fulfilled. Jesus being completely God, completely man, that completely man aspect of Jesus' nature, Jesus is a descendant of Abram, is a descendant of Abraham. And so we're always looking forward to that. And so just like in this passage, there's this huge threat, this powerful force of four kings from Babylon that Abram defeats. Sin and death are like that, and Jesus, just like Abram, will defeat them. And we know how that happens. It happens when Jesus comes and dies on the cross and resurrects. That's how those powers of death and sin are defeated for us. And just like Abram rescued Lot from those forces, Jesus, like Abram, has rescued us from sin. And so knowing that Jesus has come and that Jesus has rescued us from sin and he has defeated death, what do? We need to trust in this God to rescue us from sin. If we've never come to grips with the fact that we live in a broken world, that the brokenness is really our brokenness, and that we need Jesus to rescue us from that, then we need to do that. We need to put our faith and our trust in a God who has rescued us from sin. We need to trust in a God who keeps promises to Abraham in Genesis is the same God who keeps his promises to us. And we demonstrate that faith by obedience. And it's interesting in this passage, the change that comes on Abraham. I keep saying Abraham. He's Abram so far in this passage, but I think I said a couple weeks ago that I may accidentally use those names interchangeably. But anyways, we need to recognize that when we put our faith in God, that he makes a change in our lives. And that Abram, 2 chapters ago, was so scared of having Egyptians kill him over his wife that he was willing to lie and do all that kind of stuff, and left the promised land because of a famine and all these kind of things. And here, Abram hadn't arrived yet. There's going to be other slip-ups later, in the next couple chapters. But here we see a glimpse of change in Abram, where Abram has enough faith now that he's willing to go chase after these 4 kings. And so we need to recognize that our faith can give us courage to do the things that God has called us to do. And ultimately, as we live in a world that's broken by sin, and here the highlight is on human-caused misery that sin produces, warfare, people being ugly to each other, that kind of thing. But even as we're dealing with a more of a natural crisis in our world today, but of disease, when we think about even natural disasters, these clues that we have all around us that we live in a broken world, we can trust that if God is faithful to keep his promises to us as we live, if he's faithful to rescue us from sin, that we can look forward to the day where one day creation will be restored, and this broken world that we live in will not be broken anymore, and that we will spend eternity living and worshiping God how we were created to do. And so in the meantime, will we be faithful? Will we put our trust in this God? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for these passages that we have in the Old Testament that just speak to your power and your sovereignty over history and events. You're in a big kind of way, but that how you intervene and work in the lives of individuals like Abraham and Lot. And Lord, we just thank you that you intervened in our lives, that you sent your son Jesus to die on the cross for our sins, that he rose again on the 3rd day so that we can have life and that we can share in the new creation that one day you will bring about. Lord, help us to have courage, help us to have faith in you as we wait for that to come. In the immediate time that we live in, Lord, we just pray that you be with everybody as we're still in the midst of all this COVID-19 coronavirus stuff, and as we're thinking about moving forward, just give those that have those kind of decisions to make, give them wisdom. And Lord, we just love you, and we thank you for everything that you do for us. We thank you for the ability to talk about you and to to share your word with each other, even through Facebook and Instagram and all these other things. And we just thank you for those things as well. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. See y'all next time.